Hi there. Welcome to another episode of No Bad Ideas, a podcast from the Revs Agency, a full-service marketing agency located right here in Buffalo, New York. I am Mitch Mirsky, your host. I feel like it's been a while since I've spoken with you, and I've violated the first rule of Podcast Club, which is, second rule. First rule of Podcast Club is don't talk about Podcast Club. Second rule of Podcast Club is be consistent, for God's sakes. Holy moly. What's it been? Like a month since we last talked to you guys? Anyway, that's on me. My bad. I have to really say what I really miss most about not being a regular podcaster is this awesome theme music, right? If you are creating a podcast on behalf of a client or in a group setting, sometimes the music is so personal. It's really hard to nail down one track that everybody agrees upon. But I think we did a good job here. That actually brings me to my to maybe the subject matter of today's podcast, which is podcasting. Why podcasting? Why is it something that you should be doing or at least considering when you're creating a marketing plan for a potential client, or even just have something to say that's interesting? Obviously, being biased here, we actually have a podcast that we've created on behalf of one of our clients. It's called the Principium Pod, and it is a podcast that's in the intellectual property space. Our client is a law firm, our legal entity based in New York, Chicago, all around the world, and they really wanted to bring some messaging to their clients and potential clients in a way that was new and different. And that's kind of what we do here at the Revs, is we kind of turn things on their end a little bit and figure out, okay, what's something that you could be doing that could be reaching a targeted audience, but maybe not everyone is doing yet. And part of our MO here at the Revs is to come up with strategies and plans for our clients that maybe kind of go against the grain a little bit. What we're definitely looking to do is harness, the wave of interest with things like podcasting. If you care at all about the intellectual property world, or are interested to hear just how something else besides this podcast sounds from us, we produce the entire podcast on behalf of our client Principium, and it's there are some topics there that may be a little more generically friendly to a larger audience, but honestly, as long as we're hitting the mark with their target audience, I could care less if you like it or not. Now, having said that, of course, we would love to have you listen to the Principium Pod. That's Principium, Principium, and pod is pod, P-O-D, as in podcast. Even if it's just a chance to listen to different theme music and a podcast where I'm not talking. I thought what we might do with the rest of our time together here, you and me, is talk about some podcasts that I personally like for various reasons. And, maybe you've heard of a lot of these or not. Hopefully there are a couple of them that you haven't heard of that you might be interested in listening to. But these, for various reasons, are ones that I like to listen to on a weekly basis that are informative, entertaining, whatnot, and gives you maybe just an example of what a well-produced podcast might sound like versus this one. Another podcast that I find interesting, and from a business perspective, especially if you have an entrepreneurial spirit, is one called How I Built This. It's produced by, I believe, NPR or Planet Money from NPR. Guy Raz is the host of that, I believe, and he basically just interviews different dignitaries who have, over the past 20, 30 years or so, built up different companies. And it's fascinating because you always wonder, like, okay, if you're an entrepreneurial type, how did these people do it? What level of it was luck, what level of it was skill, and what level of it was connections or whatever it may be. And there's definitely a varying level of all of them when it goes into some of the interviews that they have there. So I definitely would recommend that one. Again, it's called How I Built This, and I think it's from Planet Money. Honestly, what got me into listening to podcasts over the last few years were some of the more political ones. So, take that for what it's worth. I'm not even going to share with you sort of my political bend, but there are definitely good ones to listen to. If you're looking for some of the more, down the middle of the road, the NPR Politics podcast is a good one. And one of the more recent ones I started listening to is Preet Bharara, who was the attorney for the Southern District of New York before he was fired by Donald Trump. Very interesting guy, and has a lot of very interesting guests on his podcast. So I would recommend that one as well. And then there are plenty of comedy podcasts. When I first started listening to the podcast, I was listening to one from Jay Mohr, Mohr, who he basically set up in his garage and would interview fellow comedians. And I kind of grew tired of his shtick a little bit, but what I really loved was he would interview comedians, but not have them do their bits necessarily. I think they were always pretty funny, but it wasn't as though it was a talk show interview where it was like sort of a wink wink, we're going to interview you and you're going to do your comedy bit right here sitting in the chair. It was more an hour-long discussion with comedians on how they built jokes, or just the business of stand-up or the business of comedy. So I thought that was pretty cool. I think you'll see that actually sort of now on Jerry Seinfeld's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee is kind of similar to that, where I think you see a mixture of comedians doing their shtick, but also just him asking specific questions about how they made it, or from a comedy standpoint. If I had to say why I gravitate so much towards the comedy side of podcasts, I think it's because, A, they're hilarious and I like being entertained, but also I sort of equate it to the work that we do on the agency side in terms of when you're creating a strategy or you're in knee-deep, trying to create something brand new, you have to get from A to Z, but maybe not in a linear fashion. So that's always, it seems like the inspiration for me has always been sort of how do jokes get built, or how does comedy happen and follow that process. And then I can't talk about podcasts, my favorite podcast, without getting into one that I listen to religiously. And again, it's comedy focused. I think it sometimes maybe just, whether it's the World Today or whatever it may be, the comedy podcasts for me are always like a good escape. And these ones, again, kind of a commitment because usually they're about an hour and a half long. But this one is called Comedy Bang Bang. It's hosted by Scott Aukerman. He had his own show called Comedy Bang Bang, a TV show that was on for about 7 or 8 years. And honestly, the podcast is just... if you're a fan of improv comedy, there's nothing better, because what he does is he'll have on a celebrity or a guest at the beginning of the show who's playing themselves. There's just the person being interviewed about a certain project that they have coming up, usually in the comedy world, but not always. Sometimes there's musicians, but and then slowly as the episode progresses, he brings in very, very talented improv actors from UCB, Los Angeles, Second City, those kinds of places. And they all come in with just basically one sort of bit of information about them. They usually all he knows is that they are what their occupation is. So he'll say, "Oh, there's a person in the service industry who's joining us today," and then they introduce the person at their name, and then that the person sort of has sort of a basic understanding of like what their background is, and then they go from there. So hilarity ensues. Usually, usually they're about 90% of the time they're just, my side is aching from the amount of times I'm laughing. And then as you listen to it more, you see there's recurring characters that come on. There's different talented comedians who make recurring roles. Paul F. Tompkins is another one of his guests that comes on frequently. So if you want to try listening to that, maybe listen to a recap episode from the previous year where they actually go through the highlights of the previous year to get a taste. That's called Comedy Bang Bang. One of the other trends in podcasting that's been pretty popular over the last couple of years are these true crime podcasts. So again, as I think you're pretty aware, I tend to lean toward more of the comedic side of things, but a good combination of that and true crime is actually a podcast called Crime and Sports. A little disclaimer, it's not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of R-rated subject material and language. Crime and Sports is, again, kind of a commitment. It's usually around 2 hours, weekly episodes, typically about every week they churn out these episodes. And real quick, the premise is pretty good. It's two comedians talking to each other, one of which he has done all of the research on a particular athlete. These athletes could be well-known athletes, such as Jose Canseco, or I don't know that they've done O.J. Simpson yet. Ray Caruth was a wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers, and that was, I think, their first episode. They're up to, 100 or so episodes, I think, and each one is amazing. James, the one comedian, does all the research on the athlete, and goes through his whole sort of life story and his professional career. And then Jimmy, the other comedian, has never heard of the story or knows very little about it, and reacts as you would or I would to hearing these insane stories from these athletes. So what's really hilarious is that you'll get those really famous athletes like the Jose Cansecos or the O.J. Simpsons, I suppose, of the world, but also really bizarre, sort of obscure sports that you've never heard of. Australian rules football. This week, I was just listening to it. I think it's a darts player from the UK. So just really hilarious and informative, but also, if you're mowing the lawn or doing the dishes, it's kind of a fun thing to listen to when at the end of the day. I guess I'd be remiss without mentioning a couple of local Buffalo podcasts that I've started listening to. One of which is from 43 North, the competition, the startup competition here in Buffalo. That one is hosted by Nate Benson. Nate is the director of digital, I think, for 43 North, and I actually just went to a little seminar that he put on about podcasting best practices, which I thought was really helpful. Nate's podcast is over at 43 North. It is called Latitude. Get the pun there, Latitude. 43 North is the latitude, line, latitude, longitude. I don't know. Anyway, it's called Latitude, and he always brings on very interesting people that have something to say about startup culture or getting your business off the ground. So give that a listen. And then being a bit biased, I live in East Aurora, New York. Have for the last 15 years. I'm a big booster of the town. It's a great little town. Our local newspaper, the East Aurora Advertiser, just launched its own weekly podcast. I think it's called Behind the Front Page or From the Front Page. Hold on. It is called beyond the front page. So give that a listen. It's on iTunes. And the second one in East Aurora, a little plug for a friend of mine, actually just launched his own podcast called EA Talks, which, not that you have to listen to these, but he actually created this because he felt like the people in the village and the town of East Aurora weren't getting all the information that they could be getting, because hardly anyone ever attends the local board meetings, due to time commitments or whatever else. So he's bringing on dignitaries from the village and the town and having them kind of discuss the major issues of the day for the town. So the first episode, it's called EA Talks. I think you can find it on the East Aurora Advertiser website. He's got the mayor of East Aurora, Pete Mercurio, talking to the superintendent of schools for East Aurora, Brian Russ, and they are actually talking about the next school budget for East Aurora schools. So, look, the point here is that if you've got an interest and you think you've got enough content to keep it going, podcasting is something you should consider. We're happy to help here at the Revs. We consult with people all the time on best practices and what equipment to use and that sort of thing. And maybe in a future episode, we'll even get into how to podcast. I'm thinking there might be a good opportunity to bring in a special guest star or something like that. So, again, if you've made it this far into the podcast, congratulations. There's a prize for you. Email me, mitch@therevsagency.com. Seriously, if you're still listening, there's a prize. So shoot me a note and let me know that you're still listening. And we will talk to you next week. Thanks so much.